Everyone. Welcome to our first graduate panel. We have three of these. I'm Fuat Gürsözlü. I'll chair this session. So we have three presenters here. Victor is here, Shoshana is here, and Tony is here. So let me introduce you, Victor Abundez Guerra. So the title of his paper is Collect Responsibility with Blame. And Shoshana McClarence, The Limits of Freedom, Intersectional Constraints Through the Peaceful Life, and Anthony White, Skepticism of Killing and Self-Defense. Each presenter will get 25 minutes. That includes the chat Q&A after the talk. So it depends on how you use that 25 minutes. You can do 1 minute talk and then 5 minutes for the discussion, or 15-10, or you can talk for the whole 25 minutes. That's completely up to you. I'll keep time and let you know when you have about 5 minutes left and then 3 minutes left. I'll send you a message through private chat. All right. So, and other participants, they can keep their cameras off, but please mute the microphone. All right, Victor, collective responsibility with blame. You have 25 minutes. There you go.
Awesome. Thank you, Fuat. Am I saying that correctly, Fuat?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. And let me go ahead and try screen sharing this. It was working a moment ago. If y'all can give me a thumbs up to see if that's working. Okay, just making sure. I timed this presentation to about 20 minutes. I have 10 slides. I'm gonna do my best to stay within the time constraints to get myself actual time for Q&A. But with that said, yes, my talk is collective responsibility with blame. And let's just get into these slides. So the outline for this presentation will start off with an introduction, sort of where I'm coming from and what has motivated this project of mine, my general thesis. So let me just go ahead and upfront that and tell you what I'm arguing, and as well as some assumptions that I am operating with. And although I'm talking about collective responsibility, we'll see that a lot of times when we talk about collectives, powerful collectives being responsible, a lot of times the conversation is not so much collective responsibility, but individual responsibility that usually implicates everybody in an individual responsibility way. So everyone's individually responsible. And usually when that happens, as we'll see, there is no blame. And there's reasons for that as well. So I'm mostly going to be talking about the social connection model from Iris Marion Young. I think it's one of the most famous ones. I know I want to talk about other ones originally in my abstract, but just for the sake of keeping this within 20 minutes, I'm going to focus on Young just because I do think it is the biggest one or the most popular one. After that, I'll talk about my approach, the collective approach, see how it's kind of different from the structural approach. I'm going to basically argue that the structural injustice, that it can be traceable, and it can be traceable to collectives. As we're going to see in the previous section, section 2, that is one of Iris Marion Young's problem for holding collectives responsible for structural injustice, that it is not traceable to them. I'm going to argue that it is. I'm also going to argue that blame should be accompanying this collective responsibility, because one, it can be motivating, and secondly, if we dismiss blame, this creates a triple burden on victims of structural injustice, victims of oppression. So that is the outline. Let's see how far into it we can get into it, actually. So thesis. The thesis is, namely, that we should adopt an account of collective responsibility that obligates powerful collectives to combat structural injustice. This account of responsibility should not sever its conceptual link with blame. Some assumptions to begin with here are that I am using the term structural injustice equivalent or synonymously with oppression. I'm also assuming that there's a default conceptual link between responsibility and blame, namely that if one fails in the responsibility, they are blameworthy. Again, I'm treating structural injustice and oppression for the most part the same, and I am using a relational account of that, which is the most popular account. A relational account of structural injustice or a relational account of oppression is just that if there is one group that's oppressed, that necessarily entails a privileged group that benefits. I also reject hyper-individualism. That comes from Alice McLaughlin and her articles in 2017, 2018, in which he says that only individuals can be the agents of responsibility. So I'm just ignoring that and rejecting that from the get-go. And I'm also so assuming to some extent that blame kind of has a bad reputation, whether it leads to defensiveness or, the no you game, the blame game. So as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to the literature of collective responsibility, a lot of times it doesn't focus too much on collective responsibility in and of itself. It focuses more on a structural responsibility or structural injustice, which implicates sort of everyone involved. And here I'm drawing from Iris Marion Young's account herself, the social connection model. Although collectives do play a large part in that, they are not sort of the only ones implicated. In fact, they're probably not the most important ones implicated under the social connection model. So collectives, especially privileged groups, governments, and powerful corporations, they do play a strong role in structural injustice. But often, as Iris Marion Young argues, we are all individually responsible for structural injustice, including victims themselves. And this responsibility does not entail blame. This responsibility does not entail blame. Now, the second one that does not entail blame, that kind of makes sense in light of one, because, if victims were responsible for their own repression, if victims were responsible for their own structural injustice, and then you had blame, then you would be victim blaming. And that can be distasteful for a good number of many good reasons. But why one, right? Why one? Why hold everyone individually responsible for structural injustice as opposed to having powerful collectives responsible? So let's dive into Young, which is, I think, the most popular account that talks about this. So she published this account posthumously in 2011, and she's concerned with injustice, structural injustice, especially sweatshops. That's one of her prime examples in her book. And she says, look, there's different accounts of responsibility. She talks about in her book. One of these accounts is responsibility as liability, where we look to the past and we blame people and we say you have to sort of pay and make things right. She says, look, that's not appropriate for oppression and structural injustice. Why? Because it's not traceable and it's not productive. Responsibility is not traceable. Responsibility as liability is not traceable and it's not productive. What do we mean by not traceable? All we mean by that is that when we have structural injustice, whether that's classism, sexism, racism, or, to use her examples, unfair economic relations, usually in sweatshops, it's a huge mess of things that includes many different agents, and it's very hard to track the individual causes to discrete agents and discrete events. It's a mess. It's a web of mess. That's what she says. It is not traceable to certain locations, documents, and agents. Secondly, even if it was traceable, she says, it entails blame, the liability model, the responsibility as liability entails blame, and blame, according to her, just sucks, right? It sucks because when you blame someone, they usually want to pass the buck, or they want to play the blame game and they want to shift it to someone else, or they just get really defensive and it is not productive. It's not productive. So in her book, Iris Marion Young says that instead of having sort of like this responsibility as liability model, instead of having blame, right? Because blame is a part of responsibility as liability, where we blame you, we look to the past, we isolate you, and then you sort of have to pay. Instead of having all that, we should have her social connection model. There, Young asked, in her book, she asked us to adopt it, right? And in that model, everyone who causally contributes to unjust structures, and again, I'm using unjust structures and structural injustice synonymously with oppression, anyone who causally contributes to oppression is responsible. She does hold no one blameworthy, however, so even though everyone who causally contributes is responsible, no one is blameworthy. And it is primarily forward-looking, not backward-looking. So it's concerned more with creating a better state of affairs. There are, of course, parameters for how much responsibility an individual or a group agent actually gets. So she uses these parameters to sort of say, you get this much responsibility, you get this much responsibility, you get this much responsibility. Her parameters are namely power, privilege, interest. Interest is a funny one. Collective ability. Oh, just those four. So the more you have of those four, the more power, privilege, the more interest, interestingly, that you have in ending oppression, and the more collective ability you have, the more responsibility you have towards doing something. So that's her account, right? What do I want to do? How am I trying to sort of go against that? Well, I want to argue that the collective approach, holding collectives, powerful collectives, responsible, is traceable. We can trace it to them. This is going against what Iris Marion Young would want us to believe, what she's arguing. And I also want to argue that blame is not necessarily unproductive, although it often is, and that should not be dismissed if we use this collective approach. So the collective approach, in a sentence, what I'm trying to do here is that certain collectives are responsible for structural injustice, certain collectives are responsible for oppression. They are blameworthy if they fail in their responsibility. That's it in a nutshell. Which collectives? Well, I'm going to say those which can have structural injustice traced back to their actions. Often this will be governments and powerful corporations, powerful businesses. Of course, the biggest thing that Iris Marion Young and others would say is like, well, how can you that even be, right? It's not traceable back to them. And I'm going to say, actually, yes, it is. I think that if we have, in a society, the proper laws, policies, and regulations in place, we can actually end up tracing a lot of structural injustice and a lot of oppression to discrete agents, to discrete corporations and governments. My inspiration for believing this is the Food Safety Modernization Act in the United States of 2011. The act gave the federal government mandatory recall authority, and corporations, they don't like to recall because they lose a lot of money and it's a hassle for them. So, on the threat of forcing them to recall, they actually have to document everything. And that makes whether there's, for instance, a salmonella outbreak or an E. coli outbreak, such as with Chipotle in 2015, that makes things much more traceable. In fairness to Young, she was primarily concerned with sweatshops in her book. And she was probably looking at the laws like the Textile Fiber Products Identification Act and the Wool Products Labeling Act. And those acts in the United States, they're like shamefully weak, and they give corporations so much power to sort of like lie on the labels. So if she was focused on that, I give it to her, as well as in the textile industry and the garment industries, it doesn't seem very traceable. But hey, look, food has done it, the food industry. Let's take inspiration from that. Let's apply that model, that level of strictness to other industries. That's what I want to argue. At this point, you might be saying, okay, well, maybe it is traceable to them, but why blame, right? If we trace it back to them, we say, oh, this structural injustice, this oppression, this E. coli outbreak, or this fast fashion, whatever, is traceable back to you. Why blame them, right? Why can't they just be responsible in the purely forward-looking sense? Well, to begin, I'm looking at the past insofar as looking at the past promotes truth-seeking and good record-keeping. That's valuable, and I think we should look into that. And also, I'm advocating here responsibility I'm advocating responsibility as liability, right? I'm looking to the past. I'm seeing that's traceable to these agents, and I'm saying you guys have to pay damages. You guys have to sort of make things right. The moral wrongdoing is traced back to a collective, and again, they are liable for those damages. This, to use Young's own terms, entails blame. So I need to get blame in here in order to have my account get off the ground. So I'm going to argue that blame can be motivating. So remember Young, and I had a quote from her, and I didn't read it just for the fairness of time to the other panelists. But she had a quote, and she argues at length in her book that blame leads to very strong reactions. Blame leads to a lot of defensiveness when we start talking about oppression, where again, that's sexism, economic exploitation, racism, or whatever, right? That leads to very strong reactions, very strong defensive reactions. I take that as an indication that it is highly motivating. However, I take that as an indication that it's highly motivating, usually in the wrong way. Usually it's highly motivating towards defensiveness. What I propose is that we try to sort of rehabilitate that motivation, rehabilitate that strong reaction, to not be so reactive, but be more proactive. What do I say here in my slide? The problem is, how do we make it so blame motivates them to accept responsibility, to rise to the occasion, maybe not, happily, but just to accept it, as opposed to motivating them into defensiveness, or as I like to call it responsibility shirking, shirking their responsibility. And here I want to take inspiration from Megan Bowler, where she writes in her book, Feeling Power, about pedagogy of discomfort, where we should welcome discomfort when we start learning about structural injustices, about oppression, and how we as collectives, or sometimes even as individuals, might be implicated in that. And truthfully, you know, this is going to be a long process, but I do think it is possible. And at the end of the day, we're not trying to make people feel comfortable when we say that they're liable or responsible for this. We're not trying to make them feel comfortable. We're trying to make them accept the responsibility, maybe begrudgingly, but accept it. And to be honest, I think this makes sense because, you know, any conversation regarding racism, sexism, oppression, structural injustice, those, I believe, shouldn't be comfortable conversations. So let's continue. Moreover, I say, when we dismiss blame, when we get blame out of the picture, that's going to create a triple burden on those who suffer the most from it, namely the victims, right? The victims of oppression. My assumption here is that dismissing blame makes our conceptions of responsibility more forward-looking, as Iris Marion Young likes hers to be, and that is concerned with promoting a good future, usually at whatever means necessary. The triple burden that I have in mind that when we dismiss blame is namely, one, the burden of structural injustice and oppression itself, right? That's always there, right? We're not creating that, but that's still there. Secondly, the burden of restraint from any of blame's associated attitudes, because blame does have a lot of associated attitudes such as anger and resentment, indignation. And if we adopt Iris Marion Young's account or a purely forward-looking account that has no blame, we're essentially censoring the victims of oppression to say, hey, you know, stop getting caught up on all this stuff from the past. Just focus on making a beautiful future, right? We'll focus on making things good in the future. And here I have a quote, which I won't read because I have about 3 minutes left. But that takes a lot of restraint, a lot of psychological self-discipline, and it can be emotionally taxing. And I would not want to put that burden on the oppressed. And finally, you know, we have the burden of fighting oppression itself. When you have a forward-looking account, as Iris Marion Young's does, you want to have as many people fighting oppression, you want to have as many people fighting structural injustice, because it's the most effective and productive way to sort of go about it. And yes, there is something to be said about effectiveness and productively doing it and quickly bringing about a good state of affairs. However, what I'm saying is, at what cost? We're putting a huge toll on those who suffer the most. And productivity is important, but it is not everything. We also have to consider who stands to suffer the most. This does not mean that they shouldn't, you know, of their own volition, if they want to, assume responsibility. But here in my account about collective responsibility, I'm talking about holding people responsible, that is, imposing the responsibility onto them. So I don't think we should impose the responsibility on the victims. But if they themselves want to take on responsibility, my account is amenable to that. I believe this is my last slide. My formalized argument, if I had to put it sort of in premises, conclusion 4, is that many current accounts of responsibility for structural injustice either focus on individual responsibility instead of collective responsibility, since structural wrongs cannot be traced back to particular collectives, and or dismissing blame, since it is seen as unproductive. And I gave one example of that, Iris Marion Young's. However, structural injustice can be traceable to collectives with the right legislation, and blame can be productive, namely by being motivating. And if we dismiss blame, I do believe that the people who stand to suffer the most from that are the oppressed, the victims of structural injustice. Because of all that, I believe we should adopt an account of collective responsibility that obligates powerful collectives to combat structural injustice, to combat oppression. This account of responsibility should not sever its conceptual link with blame. And that's it. Thank you.
And thank you so much. Well, you had 2 more minutes actually. So
okay.
So you have 6 minutes. Any questions for Victor or anything you want to add?
I'm good at this point, but if anyone has questions, I'd love to hear them or do my best to answer them. And I know I went fast there, folks. And if anyone's typing a question, thank you for bearing with me. I cut off a few slides from there, but hopefully the general idea was clear.
Let's see. So the responsibility to liability account likely incorporates accounts of intentions mattering for blame. The social connection model likely doesn't contain an account of bad intentions. With Victor's changes, what role does intention play?
So the question is, what role does intention play? And if we go with responsibility as liability, as Iris Marion Young has sort of placed it, I think if we go with that, you need intention, right? You need attention, because that's the way she has sort of thought of it. That's the way she has sort of conceptualized it. Responsibility is liability. And if we think about it, a lot of traditional conceptions of blame do need intention there. I kind of stuck with her account for the most part because I didn't want to bring in too much new stuff. But in my actual article, in my actual writing, I kind of want to move away from the idea that liability and blame necessarily or needs intention. So I want to try to break that as much as possible, that liability needs intention. I think ultimately you can be held liable if there was no intention. If there was, for instance, negligence there.
So McCann said, the best critique of Iris Young's model that I've heard. And
Thank you.
Greg has a request. Can you apply this to Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, I can try. I can try to apply this to Black Lives Matter. So let me try to apply it to Black Lives Matter on two fronts, right? Let me try to apply it to Black Lives Matter on the front of those who my account would try to hold responsible and those who I would not try to hold responsible. So I am concerned mostly in this article with organized collectives. I've been talking about corporations and governments. Under this account, we will be holding in the United States as well as other powerful corporations which have seek to disenfranchise Black lives responsible for this. And I do think we can hold. I do think we can hold them responsible because with the right legislation, we can trace back the disenfranchisement of Black folk to the U.S. government, whether that be redlining the Federal Housing Act, other, Jim Crow, going all the way back to slavery, that is traceable to the United States government. And if we take the idea of corporate personhood and apply it to the governments, like the idea of a collective person existing through time, that is an entity that we can say it is traceable to you. You need to sort of do something about it. Who it would not hold responsible are individual Americans, regardless of race, when they are acting as individuals. Now, there's a question here as whether there can be disorganized collectives acting, and there's a question here whether there can be disorganized collectives and where they should be held responsible. And I think the answer to that is yes, but I don't argue that in this paper. And finally, another group that I would not hold responsible are Black folks themselves. Often I feel that one of the psychological tolls and one of the psychological pressures of holding victims responsible for their own oppression is that a lot of times we sort of glamorize the Black struggle, or especially, for instance, Black women. We sort of rely on them to save the day, to save the election, right? To save the vote. And I don't think that should be glamorized. That puts a lot of pressure on Black lives. And a lot of times, if they want to do that and be fighting against oppression, that's great. Take that on, but we should not impose that on them because they are the ones who stand to lose the most.
So Pierce says,
yeah.
Have you explored the implications of this on restorative justice? A lot of European countries discuss victim and perpetrators coming together if the victim wants to, and working through the reasons that the crime was committed. Usually it helps foster a stronger community over time.
Right. So a little bit I've thought about this. What actually originally made me start thinking about all this, and the project has evolved, was actually the number of formalized collective apologies. For instance, in Canada, Justin Trudeau gives apology after apology to Indigenous folk, and I think rightly so. In the United States, we have a number of collective apologies as well coming from the United States government. For instance, I think in the early 2010s, the United States government apologized for Jim Crow and slavery. Um, and that is originally when we start thinking about these type of issues about collective responsibility. And one of the things I argue elsewhere, and maybe this could be, I can make a connection or bridge with the account that I've set out before you today, is that when we start making these collective apologies, or we start making these accounts of collective responsibility and how to move forward, the recipient of the apology, often the oppressed themselves, has to be involved in making that apology. They need to be invited to the table and say, hey, what do you want from this apology? Do you want lip service? Do you want symbolism? Do you want 40 acres and a mule? Do you want a check? I think they need to be a part of that conversation. And when they are a part of that conversation, I agree with the commenter that it can foster a stronger sense of community.
Thank you so much, Victor, and thank you for all the questions. So our next panelist is Shoshana McClarence, The Limits of Freedom, Intersectional Constraints Towards a Peaceful Life. 25 minutes, Shoshana.
Awesome, thank you so much. So the way we'll do this is that it'll be a little bit shorter, so we'll have a little bit more time for questions, I think. But I don't have a PowerPoint for you all to look at. You'll have to spend some time imagining, and that's how we'll start this off, right? So I'd like to imagine a time without injustice, right? It seems impossible. There's a world where hunger, poverty, unpotable water, and climate change do not exist. But I want to look even further than that, right? Into your imagination toward a time without social injustice. No racism, sexism, xenophobia, transphobia, homophobia, and so many other things. It might seem to get to this utopian world, we must eliminate every injustice one by one. And yet these injustices do not exist in separate bubbles. And in order to even comprehend and imagine a world without these, it is to imagine a world without all of these. These injustices are inherently connected in ways difficult to trace. And so instead of attempting to do so in this 20 minutes, I would like to help us visualize an interwoven world of justice and injustice. Ultimately, by seeing the world interwoven and acknowledging spaces that allow for injustice to thrive together, it is possible for us to examine a type of freedom that might give us hope in these dark times. To understand injustice, it is useful to put them in a framework. Just like with people, objects, and other physical matter, we can borrow from Bruno Latour's actor network theory to think about the intangible. The philosopher Bruno Latour looks past the world of the anthropocentric in his essay on actor network theory, a few clarifications plus more than a few complications. Latour realized that this view was limited in only looking at things from a human perspective. Instead of focusing on the small human perspective, it is imperative that other things be brought into the sphere. Latour was radical in his inclusion of actors into this narrative. Everything that has an action on humans is an actant. And with this view, all actants have a larger story to tell. In this way, we can begin to imagine actants that are intangible, like racism, that leave tangible marks upon the individual. Actor network theory allows us to begin an understanding of rephrasing space, to consider coming upon a fallen leaf on a sidewalk. Whereas perhaps a version of history would ask you to recount your walk and the characteristics of the leaf, Latour would tell us to think of the tree that the leaf came from. Think of the wind that made the leaf fall. Consider the reason why there's pavement in the first place instead of dirt for the leaf to land on. So on and so forth, all the way down to the molecules that exist in the leaf and the individual cells interacting. Where the human narrative pushes to collapse history into a summary of human experience, Latour puts everything under a magnifying lens that is not limited by human experience. In this phenomenological model, there is then room for injustice to play a role as an actant. As actor network theory gives us an understanding of our players, it also allows us to begin considering our relationships. What is done by one actant can cause chain reactions on other actants. The way in which I choose to visualize actors and relationships and space is through the Hindu myth of Indra's net. Indra is the Hindu goddess of the sky, specifically lightning, thunder, and rain. And Indra possesses an infinite net of jewels. Indra's net stretches across the sky, and every knot in the net has a jewel. When light is cast on Indra's net, the light reflects in each and every jewel boundlessly. And Indra's jewels are meant to represent every person, creature, and object that exists in the world. In a more literal sense, Indra's net represents the stars in the sky. Instead, the myth being that the stars are connected, just like everything in the mortal world is as well. If we understand these knots and nets to be stars or representations of the actants in the world, we can see that when light is cast on Indra's net, the light reflects in each and every jewel infinitely. And this infinite light cast represents our relationships and the intangibles in our world. And even more so, objects are multifaceted and many purposes and identities. These jewels reflecting in the light can be taken to represent the intersectionality of the complexity of existence, including a person's race, class, gender, and sexuality, amongst other aspects. As we think about the net, we can identify three main relationships: the perceived, the conceived, and third space. Third space today will be taken to consider power dynamics, and yet to understand third space, we must step back and to understand spatiality of consciousness. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, Henri Lefebvre and Michel Foucault, along with other Parisian scholars of the time, called for, quote, a radical transformation in critical spatial thinking, unquote. They put out this call because they believed that the perceived ideas of space were too confining and insufficient. Lefebvre and Foucault believed that many of the spatial thinkers were too focused on an emphasis of a material concept of space, characterized by the concrete, mappable, and empirical defined geographies or things in space. In this way, space was too tangible for Lefebvre and Foucault, and it was more important to understand the intricacies. Lefebvre in particular wanted to move past the two types of space that had been focused on for far too long. The first type of space is that of the perceived, which is where we understand tangible space. Perceived space could be understood as all the material, physical, or even objective space. In thinking back to Indra's net, we can think of the perceived as all the stars or the knots and jewels on her net. On the contrary, there was also conceived space, which was imaginative, right? Conceived space was understood to be made of the ideas, ideologies, and figurative images. To return to where we began, the space in which the light reflects upon each star in Indra's net is conceived, these relationships that are hard to visualize. Despite having these two spaces, there is a piece of the puzzle missing, which is Lefebvre was investigating, and posited a richer theoretical idea of space that would combine the perceived and the conceived, while also bringing in, quote, a social spatiality of human life, unquote. In this idea, we would not just be thinking about the idea of Indra's net and the light, but the space that operates behind the light and the stars. This would be for us thinking about the cosmos surrounding Indra and her net and what it's made of. What are the circumstances that made you think about Indra's net? What do you find yourself in this Zoom meeting listening to someone musing upon space? And how do we move from space to injustices? Just like at our start, these questions are complex and not completely knowable. Lefebvre actually argues that, quote, lived space, like lived time, is never completely knowable, end quote. This third understanding of combining the perceived and conceived was opening an ambiguity of spatiality. One way to make sense of this third space is thinking about this French quote that says, I never feel four walls around substance of self, the core. I feel only space, end quote. Third space is more than a location and operates through the lived experience. Indrasnat is perfect example of the perceived and conceived space, but only can work as third space when someone is living into the experience of the metaphor, which I've asked all of us to do together today. Despite this opening up of spatial consciousness, it is difficult to understand what third space looks like and how it is difficult to understand what third space looks like. And I am completely lost, so give me just 2 seconds. And how it conceptualizes this amorphous idea. In the production of space, Lefebvre describes an example of third space, starting by describing the theater with a real space that is experienced, the stage or the pit, and conceived space as the production alongside the spaces walking in between. The locations of spatial moments of walking between the stage and the pit become spaces that the audience cannot see. For Lefebvre, quote, a third space which is no longer either scenic or public and exists as both fictitious and real, end quote, which is something within the culturally constructed space and yet foreign to it. The third space is both constantly in existence and yet unknown until a person inhabits it. As confusing as third space is, there is a familiarity to it. This idea that there's ambiguity and that of sacred spaces. In fact, the reason third space sounds like sacred space is that third space interacts with the ineffable and the sacred, but most often is understood in fleeting moments instead of longer fixated experiences. In this way, all three spaces are sacred spaces, as well as intricately wound together by the human inability to perceive them as something more than otherworldly, stuck in our perceived reality. What else might operate in the background of our understandings of the world silently, working upon everyone and everything, is power. And power lives effortlessly in third space. In the History of Sexuality, Foucault famously explains, quote, power is everything, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere, end quote. As we have traced, third space is for Lefebvre what power is for Foucault. In many ways, these two ideas come out of the same struggle for an understanding of space as complex and very active. So if power lives in the experiences of third space, it seems impossible to escape from the realities of injustice. But I promised that today we'd consider hope as well. So while these stars and Indra's net can push us in both positive and negative directions, the third space is sculpted by power dynamics we're continuously creating and embedding in our spaces. There is a uniquely human aspect to understanding third space, and the pursuit of human flourishing is possible despite these heavy constraints. Yet these constraints can seem almost make it far more difficult to pursue and find tranquility in an innately unjust world. But humans have the freedom to try, and to try to lead these peaceful lives. It is not merely a question of will, but rather confluences of obstacles which might in fact make us human. Simone de Beauvoir is one such thinker here. De Beauvoir takes a practical approach to the question of existence and tries to drive the conversation past merely existing towards the ethical ramifications of existence and freedom in her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity. De Beauvoir argues that one person's freedom is contingent on another person's freedom, and in doing so, she pushes against the ideas of the existentialist as a solipsist. In her opening pages, de Beauvoir describes freedom as, quote, that which he alone possesses, of being a sovereign and unique subject amidst a universe of objects, is what he shares with all his fellow men. In turn, an object for others, he is nothing more than an individual in the collective on which he depends, end quote. De Beauvoir essentializes the value of the other in a way that is not often seen in existentialism, and this connectivity can represent a type of unity called mysticism of unity. Mysticism of unity is otherwise thought of as mysticism of interconnectivity, And as explained by Professor Don Browning from the University of Chicago in his essay, William James's Philosophy of Mysticism, there's both a mysticism of unity and mysticism of the void. Both types of mysticism refer to a type of noetic quality gained from each mystical experience, but they do so in different ways. In mysticism of unity, the individual achieves some sort of new understanding of collectivity when within themselves and the world around them. Sometimes this realization manifests an understanding of others and themselves, this higher being, or some sort of connection to a larger natural world. In contrast, mysticism of the void means the individual attains new knowledge through the disillusionment and self, specifically in a way that aligns them with a higher state of consciousness. Considering de Beauvoir's focus mood as freedom in all aspects of the term, wholly related to mysticism of unity, based on the way in which humankind is intricately connected with each other and non-human others, the embracing of freedom becomes a liberative act. Unlike the other types of moods connected to existential philosophy, freedom must instead be embraced to achieve meaning. De Beauvoir writes, quote, to will man free is to will there to be being. It is to will the disclosure of being and the joy of experience in order for the idea of liberation to have a concrete meaning, end quote. In her in her article, De Beauvoir, Existentialism in Marx, Angela Shepard goes through de Beauvoir's theory of existentialism and includes the struggle of liberation alongside existentialism. Though de Beauvoir insists women as free humans, women's situations historically, economically, biologically, and physiologically are conspired to render them as inferior, oppressed beings made into objects. This statement can be taken to mean that liberation for women is complex. And in the world of existentialism, there are two types of freedom: that ontological freedom, which is the freedom that makes humans human, and practical freedom, which refers to one's individual situation. For de Beauvoir, women's ontological freedom is restricted, but just like other people, women can transcend their practical situation. By understanding that freedom is not always universally accessible, we can see the resemblance between the inaccessibility of freedom with the unpredictability of mystical experience. Third space and the imposed dynamics of power in society render individuals' ontological freedom restricted. Perhaps everyone's individual freedom will be restricted forever. And yet, if we choose to understand the practical situation as fluid, we begin to see these larger dynamics of power as less restrictive than previously viewed, not as concrete. De Beauvoir's writing is not a way of erasing the injustices that plague Indra's net, but instead there's hope that when we value not just our own freedom, but others' freedom, and we can start to deconstruct current third space and reconstruct the world slowly by dismantling our own oppression and the oppressions of those around us. In this way, the stars in Indra's net rewrite the relationships that we have with each other, and the third space or power dynamics begin to follow. To follow the trend of existentialism, I'd like to close with a quote by Albert Camus that aligns with the shift in our understanding of freedom. Quote, the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion, end quote. Thank you so much. Do we have questions?
Thank you. All right, any questions for Shoshana?
Wanted to give a lot of room for questions because I just threw a lot of theory at you.
We have about 5 minutes. All right, so Michael Lucas has a question. Spatial ideas related to Plato's ideas of Quora.
Or yeah. So yes, it's all connected. So this is me thinking about it, trying to think about our current moment in time. And yet we can kind of trace this back to spatial ideas, Quora and chasm, even past Plato, and back into like the Minoans, thinking about spatial time and ambiguity. That's probably even past. I try to stay away from classical Greek philosophy and move past that into even more ambiguous waters here. But when you think past this idea of chasm and Quora, that can be these large ideas of kind of the unknown. I like thinking back to the Minoans and ambiguity, because I think that this is where spatiality kind of begins to be constructed into these boxes of what we perceive and conceive in this third space. Because before that, it was just all together. There wasn't these difference in perceived, conceived, and third space, but instead we were looking at ambiguity of everything all the time. And so some of these ideas can relate back to Plato, but I think even go back much further than that to think about ambiguity in general. Probably maybe overcomplicate that question.
Any other questions? We have 3 more minutes. Let's see. Well, I have a couple of questions, but I don't want to take anybody's time, so I can always email them to you. Let's see. All right, it looks like everybody's cool. So my turn. So when you talk about interwovenness of justice and just injustice and the impossibility of overcoming injustice, which is kind of part of our existence. So what kind of justice and injustice do you have in mind? So
absolutely. So I don't have a lot of justice in mind. Mostly I'm considering injustice because to me, the justice can only, unfortunately, the justice only exists with the injustice. For this article, I want to mostly focus on social injustices like racism, xenophobia, transphobia, homophobia, right? These ways in which people have injustice for each other. And I say that because third space is interesting, and not just that it's the power dynamics, but it's the power dynamics coming together with what we understand as human experience. So third space doesn't get to exist without the human element. And these injustices don't, in many ways, get to exist without the human element either. So that's what I'm thinking about in the injustice realm. I can't visualize justice, but what I can visualize is freedom. And that's why I like to end on existentialism and Simone de Beauvoir.
So I have one other question about that understanding of freedom. So the way you describe reality that's marked by justice and just injustice. So it seems to me that brings us to a concept of freedom that's always understood in terms of some sort of a struggle.
Yes.
Am I right in assuming that?
Yes, absolutely. The freedom that I am talking about always has to come with a struggle. And I see freedom as, right, just like everything in this paper, as much as I'd love to get away from the anthropocentric nature of the world, freedom in this case is the freedom of humans, which is a struggle because we don't have it all the time. And so, yes, freedom is a struggle in this way, and not something that we look at and say, oh, that bird is free or something like that.
Okay.
Thank you for your questions.
So does the struggle, so Pierce asks, does the struggle towards this ideal that you mentioned at the beginning of your paper, is it something achievable or something that we should picture?
I know that the answer that you're not supposed to ever say at a conference is I don't know, but I don't know if it's achievable. I'd like to think it is, but I'd like to think that our existence, right, the ideal that we are striving towards has something to do with this freedom that we are putting towards ourselves and putting towards others, and right, lifting each other up in freedom. So perhaps one day when we all lift each other up in freedom, it will be an ideal. But until then, I guess we'll just have to picture it.
All right, thank you so much, Oshana. So now our next presenter is Tony White, and the title of his talk is Skepticism of Killing in Self-Defense. Here you go, Tony, 25 minutes.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. So, as he said, my name's Tony White, and my paper is Skepticism of Killing in Self-Defense. And I'm sure it looks really promising from the title page here. So my goal will be to convince you by the end that I'm not totally crazy. All right, so I'm a virtue ethicist, and so my actual view is that it is more virtuous not to kill in defense of one life, although it is excusable. So for me, the fundamental moral categories are better and worse, but most people use permissible and impermissible. And so I'm going to take up more of a rights-based perspective for the sake of argument in this paper. And I'm just going to argue that it's, my thesis is going to be it's unclear that killing in defense of one life is permissible. So it's a skeptical thesis. Oh, trying to get the next one to come up. Okay. So my argument does not apply to less than lethal violence. It doesn't apply to killing to stop prolonged torture, because prolonged torture could arguably be worse than death. And it doesn't say anything about killing in defense of more than one life. And so it leaves open the possibility that it could be justified to kill in defense of lives, multiple lives beyond some threshold. So Andrew Fiala has claimed that one way to understand pacifism is as a critical social theory. Like feminism could be understood as a critique of patriarchy, pacifism could be understood as a critique of violence. And so that's the way I'm approaching this paper. So it's supposed to be an imminent critique of the rights-based self-defense literature. So I'm assuming the rights-based perspective for the sake of argument for this paper and kind of doing an internal critique. And this puts me in a tradition of skeptical pacifism, which includes the Jains and Leo Tolstoy and Gandhi, and more recently Cheney Ryan. And actually Fiala, if you include anti-war pacifist, skeptical pacifism. Okay, so the first point I'll make is that killing is a very grave wrong. So I'm going to call it the gravity of killing. I think we would all pretty much agree that killing is a very grave wrong, but I'm trying to analyze, maybe why. And so from a rights-based perspective, the two main wrong-making features of killing would be that it violates the right to life and that it causes harm. And so on these two dimensions, it's especially bad because, okay, scope and finality. So another rights violation might be narrow because it still leaves the rest of your rights intact. But if the right to life is violated, you also lose all your other rights, okay? Also, it is final because for another rights violation, it might be possible to fulfill duties of reparation toward the victim. It might be possible for the victim to overcome the wrong to have an overall good future. But if the victim is killed, you can't fulfill duties of reparation towards them, and there's no way to overcome being killed to have an overall good future. So killing destroys the capacity for all present and future rights and welfare, making it an especially grave wrong. Okay, so when killing is wrong, it is a grave wrong. This also shows that it's significantly worse than just wounding, because wounding would be more narrow and not as final. And so if you where this might, partly where this is going is if you kill and you would have only been wounded, it's actually, I'm going to say that that's disproportionate. Also, to risk wrongful killing is to take a grave moral risk. And so I have the principle of proportionate caution. The graver moral risk that an act involves, the higher should be the epistemic burden for its permissibility. So if it's a minor wrong, you might be able to take a bigger risk of committing it. But if we're talking about a really grave wrong, a really grave moral risk, then the standard should be really high. You should be really sure that you're not committing this. So therefore, one should not kill unless its justification is extremely clear. And I'm going to argue that it's unclear that this burden is ever met in the case of killing in defense of one person. Okay, and so I'm going to make a comparison of my argument with a very similar argument made about the death penalty. So the United States is one of the only democracies that still has the death penalty, but even here, the Supreme Court has added post-conviction procedural hurdles for heightened reliability because they say death is different. So basically the same argument that I was just making, that death is, killing is especially bad and so, or especially risky. And so we need extra reliability, higher epistemic burden on the judgment. But even so, many still oppose the death penalty altogether due to the possibility of mistakes and racial bias in its application and its irrevocability as a punishment. But these same points also apply to killing in self-defense, including for police who are actually specially trained in defense. I mean, we've seen there's nationwide protests about police making mistakes in defense and it being racially biased. Okay, also people have personal bias, just that we are likely to be biased in our own favor and to favor our own interests and self-preservation and to overestimate when it's justified to kill in defense. The bias in your own favor would come on especially strong in a high pressure, high stakes situation, like a case of apparent self-defense. And so I raised the question, if conviction beyond a reasonable doubt in a trial by jury may be insufficient to justify lethal punishment, then is individual judgment in the heat of the moment sufficient to justify lethal defense? Okay, now obviously people will say that there's a relevant difference, that defensive harm is more permissive than punishment because defensive harm can directly prevent harm, whereas punishment doesn't. I'm gonna come back to that at the end, but overall I'm gonna be arguing that the two are really not sufficiently differentiated. Okay, so now about proportionality. So if we use the same standard of proportionality as we use for punishment, then it would be disproportionate because the most the person could be guilty of at the time that you kill them in self-defense, it could be attempted murder at most. However, when we're talking about defense, that's not really the standard. It's not what they've already done, it's what they're going to do and what you're preventing. So the proportionality for defense is between the harm that you inflict in defense and the harm that you prevent the aggressor from inflicting. But the problem with that is that we don't actually know how much harm they would have inflicted. We don't know what would have happened otherwise. If the aggressor is killed, we don't know for sure if you saved the life or not. At least it's not guaranteed. Okay, David Roden has a paper called The War Trap, and he argued for adding a moral contingency to the proportionality calculation for war to avoid a substantial moral risk because of these two factors. One is the unpredictability of harms in war, and the other one is that the duty not to harm is stronger than the duty to prevent harm. So basically, our proportionality calculations are very uncertain. Now, you could make a mistake in either direction, but he says that if you don't fight a war that would have been proportionate, that's not as bad of a mistake. But if you fight a war that is disproportionate, that's a bigger mistake. And the reason is because basically killing is worse than letting die, or we have more of it, pretty much every rights ethicist would agree that we have a stronger duty not to commit rights violations than we have to stop others from committing rights violations. Okay, so these two factors also apply, maybe to a lesser degree with the first one, but it still applies. So these two factors also apply to self-defense, that the harms are somewhat unpredictable, and that that killing is worse than letting die. And I could actually add in the personal bias that I talked about from before might be another reason for the moral contingency. So I'm proposing adding this same moral contingency to self-defense. And so if killing in defense of one life would have been exactly proportionate, then adding this moral contingency, we would be treating it as disproportionate then. This also answers the possible objection that the gravity of killing goes both ways. So when I was going through it, you might have thought, well, if it's grave for me to kill, it's also grave for them to kill me. Yeah, but that's really more their responsibility, because we have a stronger responsibility not to commit rights violations than to stop others from doing so. Okay, so the standard account of, I'm going to talk about the standard account of defensive harm now. They call it liability to defensive harm. And they say an aggressor is liable to proportionate defensive harm if and only if they meet these four factors. Number one, they pose a threat. Number two, the threat is unjust. Number three, they are responsible or culpable for the threat. And number four, defensive harm is necessary to avert the threat. And the underlying rationale behind the account is that if there is a forced choice between lives, the person who created that should bear the cost or the risks. So basically, if it's a kill or be killed situation, then the person who created that situation should be the one who is killed. Okay, so I'm going to raise some doubts about this. But the first thing I wanted to point out was that factor 1, 3, and 4 all involve thresholds. Meaning that, like, how high does the threat, like how strong of a threat does it have to be? How responsible do they have to be? How slim does our chance of escape have to be, or something like that? And so the principle of proportionate caution says that we should be extremely clear that we're justified in killing before we do it. And so that would suggest, when in doubt, to err on the side of drawing the thresholds at the high end. Okay. And I'll just note that it is possible to be mistaken in any of the four criteria, about whether a threat exists at all, or whether it reaches this, the high enough threshold. In a case of mutual escalation, it could be unclear who actually started it. It could be unclear whether the person is sufficiently responsible, or it could be unclear. You could make a mistake and think that you had no other option when you actually had another option. Okay. So it's possible to be mistaken about any of them. Okay. All right, now I'm going to analyze this idea of a forced choice. So take this example where someone plays Russian roulette and points the gun at you. Most would consider this sufficient to justify lethal defense. But your chance of being killed would only be 1/6 at most in that situation. So one question you could raise is, does that reach the threshold threat level? I mean, most people would apparently say that it does, but there's still more that we can ask about this. So notice that if you were to fire a fully loaded revolver back at the exact same time, you would actually pose 6 times the threat that the aggressor poses to you. And also, you don't aim to shoot at the same time as them. You would aim to shoot before them. So you could argue that this is disproportionate because your threat is stronger and stronger than theirs. Okay. I'm also going to add that we don't really know with certainty that a situation is a forced choice. It's at a certain point you're making a sort of a jump or an assumption, at least to some extent, that it's a forced choice. And so I'm going to give an extreme example of Malala. I'm sure you guys know Malala, who was a Pakistani girls' education activist, who was, it's probably the paradigm case of what you would think would be justified self-defense. She was shot in the head by a terrorist on her school bus. and she survived. Okay, she's also Nobel Peace Prize winner and pacifist, as it turns out. So you don't know 100% that it's a forced choice. Okay, now if you think about this, attempting lethal defense usually makes it more likely that at least one person will be killed. That actually makes it more like a forced choice than it would have been usually. So if making it a forced choice is what causes you to be liable to defensive harm on this account, then they would have to explain why the defender is not also liable to counter-defensive harm from the aggressor. And especially in the case like the Russian roulette case where they escalate the level and imminence of the threat, I'm sure that's not an implication that you would want on this theory. So that's something to think about. Okay, and then we have the factor of the criterion 3 is the hardest to judge probably out of the 4 factors. There are different philosophers with all these different accounts of it. Some say you only need responsibility, moral responsibility for the threat. Some say that you need culpability, you have to be blameworthy. Some people say you don't need either. And then the accounts range from only requiring a minimal amount to a high threshold. So if there are plausible arguments for all these different accounts, and so if they are similarly plausible, the principle of proportionate caution, how do you know, how sure are you that the one that you picked is the right one? And so maybe we should err on the side of caution and go with the most restrictive account. And that would be the high threshold culpability account. I also happen to think that this one is the best on its merits because it's the least luck-based. Because if somebody is totally blameless, it's hard to explain how they're really different from an innocent bystander, and so why you would be able to kill them and not kill the innocent bystander, okay, if they're both equally blameless. Okay, but if we go at the high threshold culpability account, then an unknown partial excuse could easily render the aggressor non-liable. For example, a mental illness. I mean, a lot of the time, a person themselves doesn't even know they have a mental illness, and sometimes a psychologist can't even diagnose it. So you're not going to know if a stranger might have this, and there could be other mitigating factors that we have no idea about, and so that might be problematic. How much time do I have? I might have to skip this slide. Yeah, that's the least important slide. I think I only got like 3 minutes.
4 minutes.
4 minutes. If there's not enough questions, I'll go back to that one. Okay. So, all right. I'm going back to the, okay. I'm going back to the objection that punishment and defense are different, supposedly, because defense directly prevents harm. I'm going to address that now. So, suppose the Joker culpably points a secretly unloaded gun, causing Batman to have a justified but false belief that the criteria for lethal defense are met. Most would agree that it's justified in this case because the evidence pointed in that direction. Okay, but if direct harm prevention is supposed to be what separates defense from punishment and makes the standards for defense more permissive, why would that apply here? Because no harm is actually directly prevented. Okay, so the response would probably be that evidence relative justified defense prevents harm in general. If we had a general policy of lethal defense when it was evidence relative justified, it could reduce harm overall, because the evidence normally points us in the right direction, and so most of the time it would work right. The problem is that that's actually indirect harm prevention. If you say that it prevents harm in general, that's like deterrence, okay? Because you could say, well, if people knew that they were going to use evidence relative justified defense, then they wouldn't attack as much. But then we're talking about, indirect harm. We're talking about deterrence, which also applies to punishments. That doesn't differentiate it. Also, I would argue that it's unclear that it actually does prevent harm in general. That's debatable. If you look at Norway, hardly anyone owns a gun for self-defense in Norway, and the police don't even carry guns. And the US has 10 times the murder rate as Norway. And in 2011, a Norwegian terrorist killed 77 people on an island. And before the Norwegian police could get there, they have guns that are locked away for a case like this, an extreme emergency. Before they were able to get the guns and get to the island, he had killed 77 people. 77 people in Norway is equivalent to like almost 5,000 people in the US. The US murder rate was still twice as high as Norway in that year. Okay, so it's at least questionable. You know, if we had a general skepticism of self-defense, or then that maybe that would result in less harm. Okay, the other objection that people would have is that the Joker brought it on himself. They would say, well, yeah, Batman had fault. Batman was wrong, but that's because the Joker caused him to have faulty information, and so it's the Joker's fault, and so it's okay if it's acceptable if he pays the consequence in this case. But then this judgment is based purely on the Joker's culpability, independent of any threat or the other factors of liability to defensive harm. And so this would make it a case of desert rather than liability, and of punishment rather than defense. And culpability remains after the action. So that means that he would be, then he could get the death penalty for this act of aggravated assault. And so this doesn't really separate it from punishment. Okay, so that's, thanks. I hope I seem less crazy than at the beginning. So, but thanks and I'll take questions.
All right, 4 minutes. All right, folks, what questions do you have for Tony? Tony, while we wait for people to write, I have one question about intention. How does intention factor in this whole argument? So let's say here's what I have in mind. So let's say all those conditions are met. So there's a threat. So the threat is unjust. So and all that stuff. And under duress, I defend myself. My whole intention is to eliminate the threat, but not to kill.
So sort of like the doctrine of double effect.
Yep. So I mean, the killing is just an unintended outcome. So under duress, I just, instead of aiming for the leg, I just aim for the heart. And I regret it. I didn't want this to happen, but it happened. So what would you say that sort of a situation? So how does intention become part of your argument, or does it?
I mean, I do think that it's excusable. I did mention that in the first slide. So I do think the duress is an excuse. And so I don't think that we should blame the person. You shouldn't have killed them in self-defense and also because that would be like blaming the victim, and it would distract from the idea that the aggressor is more wrong. So I would say that as far as not intending to killing is like a side effect, and you're not intending to kill. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I have more to say about it from my virtue ethics perspective, that it would be a mitigating issue. But when I'm assuming this rights-based perspective, they kind of ignore it. So I'm not thinking of a great answer to that right now.
All right, we have 1-2 minutes. Anyone else has a question for Tony?
I guess from the virtue ethics perspective, like I would almost think it's if you were being attacked and you just reached and grabbed something and hit them on the head, I almost feel like that's better than if you are carrying a gun and like suspicious of everybody as being a threat. I see that as less virtuous, and making you prone to make a mistake. So maybe that's where intention would factor in, almost like how do you prepare? It's like, how do you train yourself to see everyone as threats, which makes you overestimate? Or, and I would see like, and then if you only reach for self-defense at the last moment in duress, I feel like that's more virtuous.
All right,
Maybe
we
that
have
helps.
two questions, Tanya. One from Greg. From a rights-based perspective, who has a right to play 1/6 chance to kill you? Do you see that in the chat?
Yeah, I would say they don't have a right. I mean, they're doing something wrong, for sure. So the question is whether they forfeit their right to life by doing that. On the standard account, they do, but I guess I'm kind of pointing out that does the forfeiture have to be all or nothing? Because if you go on to pose a bigger threat than they pose to you, did the forfeiture actually drop below what they did to you, right? And if, is that logical?
So we have one more question, but time is up. Let me read the question and leave it there. All right. So this is from Steven De Lorenzo. So I see cases in which cases that look like self-defense, where a defender using force might be wrongfully harmful the person that looked like an aggressor. But if you use your CPP, in some cases, the defender might act impermissible by not harming the aggressor. You might refer to the asymmetry about creating versus preventing, but in this case, it would be preventing and not harming. All right, so we need to end this here. So Tony, you can think about that question or chat with Stephen later if you like.
Sure.
Thank you so much to our presenters, and thank you so much for all the wonderful questions, everyone. So
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Greg.
you very much. Thank you very much for the wonderful talks.
Thank you for the invitation. Take care, folks.
Wonderful
Take care,
to be
Victor.
here. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Shoshana.